Nashville, Tennessee, May 29, 1819. Mr. Townsend, I seat myself and take pen in hand to answer yours of the 20th instant, and congratulate you on a safe return to the northward. It is a truth generally acknowledged that good company and good discourse are the very sinews of virtue. This being so, I thank you for providing both during your brief sojourn among us. If you had half as much enjoyment in your visit as we had in hosting you, I should esteem that a successful endeavor indeed. I believe it goes without saying that you are always welcome with your friends here in Tennessee, and should you ever return, as I hope you shall, know that there will always be a place for you at our table. My best wishes for yourself and friends and family. I look forward to following whatever adventures lie in store for you with great anticipation. I shall now close, as I wish to get this in the post today. I remain, sir, as ever, your most particular servant, B. Allison. P.S. Please accept my favor of a full cask of the finest Dutch nutmeg just arrived at this place. Knowing your proclivities in the area of gastric experimentation, I trust you shall find it of use.
We're here again today with Brian Allison, and we're talking more about letters and writing, and this is having to do with sealing stamps. We are in Tennessee. Where are we at exactly?
Absolutely. We're at historic Mansker Station at the Bowen Campbell House in Goodlettsville, Tennessee.
What's the date for this house?
It's 1787.
1787. Amazing house. Beautiful site. We're having lots of fun, and we've covered a lot of writing, making quills, the kind of paper, the kind of ink you need. But sealing, letter sealing, is always a fun thing to talk about. So get us into this letter sealing.
Well, once you've written your letter, obviously you want to seal it. And of course, in those days, they didn't have envelopes yet. Well, they did, but they were expensive, and most people didn't use them. So generally, you use the back of your letter.
So you actually use your letter as the envelope?
Yeah, the back of the letter. So for example, if you're writing on this side, then leave this side blank, and then this becomes where you're going to put your address and fold it up. So the envelope starts from that, and when it's done, you're going to see something that looks a lot like this, with the seal on one side and the address put on the other.
Right.
So, I've just got here a collection of different seals, wafer stamps, which is a little bit different, different methods that they used in period to close their correspondence to send it in the mail.
So the seal material itself, it's called sealing wax, right? But it is not wax.
It is not wax. It started as wax. In the Middle Ages, it was a mixture of beeswax and other different things. Olive oil was in it, and a colorant. But that was a very primitive kind of wax, and it didn't work very well. It becomes what we call sealing wax in the 16th century, when shellac is starting to be imported to Western Europe. And then you start getting these sticks, kind of like these ones here, which are pure, they're shellac, rosin, a colorant, binder, different materials. That gives you a wax that's very, very hard and brittle. And that's also kind of a built-in security feature. So if your correspondence is being read and somebody's broken the seal, you'll be aware of it when you see that. So that's the original kind of sealing wax. And that's still sold today as traditional wax, or they have different names for it. But if you want to seal your letter in period manner, that's what you're going to look for. Modern waxes tend to be that bright red right there, which is fairly close. It's not great. The difference between modern and the old style stuff is that this is, they sometimes market this as mailable or flexible wax.
Right.
That's important if you actually want to send your stuff through the mail. The U.S. Postal Service is no longer equipped to handle sealing wax. If you use this shellac base, the traditional wax, and you send that to the mail, you may very well jam the machines and cause all sorts of problems at the post office.
Yeah, if you want to do that, put your letter that you've sealed inside of a padded envelope and ship it that way, and it'll actually get there intact and not destroyed and destroy their equipment at the same time.
Exactly. There is some etiquette to wax if you're going to be doing it. It came in different colors. So blues and greens were used for informal correspondence.
Okay.
The most formal color of all was red. So if you're going to be trying to replicate, say, a military or a
government document,
document, legal, red is really, and really in most formal correspondence, red is the go-to. What you want to avoid is black. Black is a bad sign. This is actually shorthand. If you saw a seal with a black border, or a black seal and a black border on your letter, it's shorthand for you need to sit down before you open this, because that usually means
bad
death
news
in the family, bad news, funeral
It's
announcement.
mourning. Okay.
Yes. So that tradition goes back into the 17th century, and so most people wouldn't use. I've actually seen an extant letter in which the person apologizes for the shock and saying, "I'm sorry I used black wax, but I didn't have anything available." So the poor person who opened it must have been horrified.
Sure. So, how about other methods of sealing? Well, while we're here with these sealing, we've got sealing wax stamps here. Right?
Exactly, and as you can tell, I'm a bit of a fanatic about collecting them.
Sure.
But everything. These are different sizes, different types. Many of the seals at the time, these are called desk seals, and this is the sort of thing a lady or a gentleman would have on their desk, so they could seal formal correspondence. But they came in different sizes, but there's other types as well, and this is, I'm just absolutely drooling over, I just have to say. This is one of my favorite things in your catalog. It's a signet rings, and that's a very typical thing for a lady or a gentleman to have their coat of arms or some symbol there. And you can use it that way. Most people take it off, and if you've ever used one, you find that out quickly. It's
Unless you want to burn your hand.
Exactly. But this one, in fact, is particular. It's a memento mori. What is the story on that?
Well, memento mori is that 17th and 18th century movement that means remember your mortality. So remember you're going to die someday, so you shouldn't just live life just any old way, right? And so that particular design, I think, is off a Jamestown find.
That's what I thought, and this is a wonderful reproduction. There's problems with sealing wax. It can be messy, it can be dangerous in cases. You've got to be careful with it. So even in that time period, the late 18th, early 19th century, people were looking to come up with alternatives. And one of the ones they came up with was the sealing wafer. Now this is a little bit obscure. You're not going to find a lot on the market. Wafers became the quick, easy substitute for sealing wax. And really it's just a tiny little round dough disc. And what they would do normally in those days is put it under their tongue and write their letter, and that would soften it while they were going, while they were writing. Then you fold your letter, and at the last minute, pull it out, stick it under the flap, and close it down. And you're going to close it with what they called a wafer seal, and you can see these.
So it's completely different than these with a special design. They all have a grid type pattern.
Exactly. That grid is characteristic, and in fact, I did one earlier where you can see it. Right there, that is the characteristic stamp you see in a lot of early 19th century letters. That indicates it was sealed with a wafer seal. Now, this was used a lot. I mean, it was so much more convenient than the wax stamp. A lot of times, especially in this climate, I'm in the American South, which means I've actually seen an etiquette book that says you want to use wafer seals rather than wax because it'll melt in the and stick together in the postman's pouch in this climate.
Wow.
I've actually had that experience ordering it through the mail. It'll stick together. So the wafer's very common, but also keep in mind the etiquette. There's a lot to keep in mind when you're writing this. If you're of a certain station, if you're of a gentleman class or something, and you receive this in the mail, that's a bit uncouth. And that was, through that whole period, you see complaints about this because it came out of somebody's mouth a lot of times. So that is considered, you don't send that to somebody of important station. You never send formal correspondence this way. But for a letter between friends, a letter to your grocer or something like that, the wafer seal is so much easier, more convenient than that.
And this wafer is, it's like a tiny ship's biscuit. It's just a very, very simple flour, very, very thin. So I want to see a letter get sealed, but before we do that, let's talk about the folding, because we have to have a letter folded before we seal. Is there special things to folding? Are there different kinds of folds?
Well, good news and bad news. Part of the romance, I think, of this whole process is the letter fold, and in the early days, the 15, 16, 1700s, it was a very individual process. And there were several different types of folds, some of them very intricate, some of them with built-in mechanisms to keep them from being pried into, that sort of thing. Sadly, for our time period, we're concentrating on the late 18th, early 19th century, and by the second quarter of the second half of the 18th century, letter folding was pretty boring. It had gone down to a simple, what looks like very much a modern envelope today. So A lot of those intricate letter folds have been lost over time, and they're just now being resurrected. One of my favorite channels on YouTube is there's an MIT professor named Jana D'Ambrosio, and she runs a channel called Letter Locking, and that's what she's doing is actually reconstructing these intricate ways of folding they used in the pre-modern, the early modern era.
We'll make sure to put a link down in the description section.
Absolutely. So if you're interested in that era, and I highly recommend you look at her channel because she's a scholar. She's done the research, probably the foremost expert on that process living today. So what we're going to demonstrate today is really just a simple one-sheet letter fold. So if you're writing on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper or something similar, this is the sort of thing that almost everybody used to fold their correspondence in the late 18th, early 19th century. You can do this without, but one thing that makes your life a lot easier is invest in a bone folder if you want to do this a lot. This helps you make your creases very sharp, and it helps to get into tight corners, and you'll see that as we go through.
Helpful. Yep.
Exactly. So with this sort of letter fold, the simplest one, what you're going to do is first start with, remember, all this is your writing up here. This is where your letter is. The sheet's blank for the address. So you're going to start with the writing side up, and you're going to fold in your sides. Try to make them as neat as possible as you go down. So there's one there.
So you're folding in about 1.25 inches.
About 1.25 inches. It isn't exact science, and it doesn't have to be centered either, because the entire package is going to be
a rectangular.
Yeah, a rectangular anyway. So leave a little space in the center a lot of times, especially with a letter this size, and that should be enough. Doesn't have to meet in the center. And again, none of this is set in stone. Every letter, it seems, is folded differently by a different correspondence. So that's your first fold right there. So you got your two sides folded in. Now starting from the bottom of the letter, you start folding it up. And again, you rough it out. That's probably about 1/4 of the way up. And this is where the bone folder really pays for itself, because once you get up here, you're going to tend to get crinkly and crunchy down here in the corners.
Yeah.
Well, if you put your bone folder in there, pull down, that's going to neaten everything. Now, here's a little pro tip for everybody. At this point, stop using this bone folder to crease until you're done, because you're going to have to adjust it a little bit as you go up. So to keep it neat, you're going to just take that right on that line there.
And keep going
Fold
one
it up
more.
one more time.
Okay.
And that's going to give you the top flap of your envelope.
Okay.
So flatten that pretty good. And then the top flap comes down. And now it's starting to really look like an envelope.
Sure.
The last trick is, you don't want to just, you can do it this way. I've seen examples done this way, but it's very neat, it's very ugly, it's not very
corners want to kick up and everything.
And it doesn't hold everything secure.
Right.
So this can break loose in the mail or something like that. What they would do generally is take this bottom part here, there's your top flap, tuck one corner in, and this takes a little adjustment, tuck the other corner in. Now that it's done that way, now come back in with your bone folder and make sure it's nice and crisp and flat, and there is your folded letter.
And it doesn't easily come loose. So
right, and so it holds that shut. Plus, the other advantage of this is once you put the seal here, it's only going through one layer of paper, so if you cut that loose, you won't damage, hopefully, the writing underneath, and you won't make the letter illegible.
Sure.
So that's the simplest and most common way of folding a letter in the late 18th and early 19th century.
So sealing is a little trickier. There are a lot of different kinds of wax. You've got the standard red stick, the kind we carry. That's the real shellac. It doesn't have a wick in it.
Right.
A lot of the waxes you see today have wicks in them. At least with this style of wax, I don't like it when it has a wick in it. It really gets in your way.
It really kind of does, and that is not something they would have had at the time. The wick in the sealing wax probably dates to the 1890s, early 1900s, so sealing wax was sold in large sticks. Okay, here we go. We're going to try this. It's going to take a while. Start probably a quarter inch down from the top, and just kind of get the sides started. Be careful, because especially with the shellac wax, it has a tendency to want to catch fire. That's not the end of the world either, but you just don't want flaming bits of wax going everywhere while you're doing this. And after a while, you'll notice it'll start to want to bubble and melt and want to try to move around on you. Once that starts, it's just a juggling act. Start shifting your hand and playing with that little molten ball of wax, and keep it moving, because if you stand in one place, it'll catch fire, it'll drip all over the place. Here we go, we're going to try it. One blob there. In it goes. Give it just a second. And move your...
And there's your seal. Perfect.
And a
No
perfect seal.
You did it perfect.
That was surprising because if it was going to go wrong, it usually happens in a situation like this. So
you got to be careful. You might mess it up. Let's do a wafer. I want to see how much
the
faster
wafers
this is.
are fairly simple. And again, this is going to be a little bit. It'll be faster even then because I'm not putting it under my tongue.
Right.
The formula I use, I don't know what kind of things I might catch, but we're going to use the damp cloth. We just need a moisture there, and I'm going to use my wafer stamp here. Find the spot here where you're going to put that thing in, and then just dampen the surface just slightly, and that'll help it catch.
Okay.
And then what we're going to do is just get this thing wet a little bit. So a little bit of dripping in there. Okay, now I've got some water on there, and just start melting that glue right there. And I can already feel it getting tacky and sticky and yucky, and that's what you want. And once it gets to about that consistency, yeah, that's about right. Stick that up under where the wet
connects, yeah.
point is. You can even see it ghosting to the surface there. Take your wafer stamp, and it takes a fair bit of muscle, I find, to you want to
get that impression.
Get those basically those fibers to connect so the glue sticks.
And then we get a nice look to it.
And you get that character board, of course, called a waffle effect or a checkerboard effect. But that's the characteristic effect of a wafer seal. And I see that in a lot in early 19th century correspondence that I've handled. It was advisable to let it dry before you send it in the mail. So it might take 10, 15 minutes for that to fully dry before the glue is actually set. Otherwise it can still pop open in the mail pouch. Yeah,
and I would think moisture or, you know, if it got damp, it might undo. But since this letter is sort of sealed, you know, it folded up into itself, it's not really going to pop open.
You know, and the one I did earlier, you can see it's not coming loose. It will not come loose. So it's a fairly secure way of holding it shut.
We've got our letter. It's sealed up. What about postage? What's the post office like?
Well, you're going to actually put your address or your direction, as they said in those days, your direction on the blank side away from the seal, and then you're going to drop it in the postman's bag, or you're going to go to the post office if you're in a big city, or you're going to give it to a friend to drop off at the post office. It's not rocket science in those days. They're still developing it, especially in the late 18th, early 19th century. There are some advanced post offices like Philadelphia under Ben Franklin. They're all based on the British Postal Service. Out in the boondocks where I'm from, Tennessee, it was basically a mailman's pouch and taking the mail down the Natchez Trace to New Orleans and back up into Virginia. So that could be haphazard, that could be subject to the weather, to hazards on the trail, and that's all going to affect postage.
Now, sometimes you read in the journals like, oh, I left the letters at the tavern or whatever, where they might come in 2 weeks to pick them up.
Right, and you're thinking to yourself, well, how did they get them to the recipient without paying for it? They just dropped them off. Well, that's one of the things about the postage in those days. The recipient paid the charges, not the mailer. So this is free to drop in the mail. It's not free at the other end. So whatever charges go through, and it's charged on the mileage it went, the weight of it. That's why they were trying to use as little paper as possible.
Right, so you don't use an envelope because that weighs more.
Exactly. So if you're adding to that, that's going to add to the charges, the difficulty of the journey. So if it's going over rivers in a postman's pouch, that's going to add to it. So all that factors in. And then once that gets to the other end, whoever gets the letter has to pay all those charges.
Sure.
So a lot of times you'll see dead letters, they call them, dead letter office, where somebody didn't recognize the signature, didn't know what it was about, said, I'm not going to go to that much trouble, and threw it back. And some of those have never been opened in 200 or 300 years.
Wow.
So
that'd be a treasure trove, wouldn't it?
Well, there's actually in what was this? In the Netherlands recently.
Nice.
A trunk of I think it was 1,200, and I think only 800 of them were still unopened, and they'd been posted anywhere between 1670 and 1720. You talk about a treasure trove. It had just sat in the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands for the last 100 years, and nobody had opened them. So they're just now starting to go through and scholarly change it. I think it's called the Signed, Sealed, Undelivered project, and it's great to watch online if you really want this the trivia of how to do this. As it goes through the journey, and this is something I teach in my classes, it's going to pick up character, and that's one of the things to make it look real. Postal stamps. Not like today, they didn't use a prepaid stamp. That would come along in the 1840s. But as it goes through, postal marks would be applied by usually lead stamps in those days, dipped in ink and stamped to the letter. I teach methods for replicating it. Of course, you can get rubber stamps today to do the similar things. There's other ways to do it. But I find that really adds to the character. As ship letters that came through the post overseas, it really kind of adds to the character and lets you see where the journey came from and the narrative that the letter would tell.
Sure. Brian, such an interesting story about folding, sealing, and the Postal Service. Thanks for bringing that to us.
Absolutely, thank you.
If you need more, if you want more information, make sure to check out Brian's website. We'll make sure to put a link down in the description section of this video. We are at this wonderful site here in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. We'll put a link down to that in the description section also. If you want more information on quills, paper, ink, make sure to check out this playlist.